The Power Law, Venture Capital, and the Making of the New Future by Sebastian Mallaby. Picture this, a 54-year-old professor crawling around his backyard on his hands and knees. No, he's not searching for a lost contact lens. This is Patrick Brown, one of the world's leading geneticists, carefully digging up wild clover roots on the Stanford campus, right in Silicon Valley's beating heart. To any neighbor peeking over the fence, he probably looks like he's lost his mind. But Brown is on a mission, one that starts with these humble roots and ends with the potential to completely upend a trillion-dollar global industry. Here's what was eating at Brown. He knew that raising animals for food was absolutely devastating our planet. It gobbles up a third of the world's land and pumps enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Like so many of us, he felt paralyzed, wondering what on earth one person could possibly do about it. Then a friend tossed out a casual comment that changed everything. If you could make a vegetarian burger that tasted better than a beef burger, the free market would magically take care of the problem. That simple idea set Brown's mind on fire. Of course you could make a better burger. Why wasn't anyone treating this like an actual problem with an actual solution? So he dedicated his sabbatical to cracking it. Those clover roots he was digging up? They contained a special molecule called heme, the very thing that gives meat its bloody, savory, iron-rich flavor. Brown figured he could use plant-based heme to create a vegetarian burger that would sizzle, smell, and taste just like the real thing. Now, in most places on Earth, this is where our story would fizzle out. A brilliant but slightly eccentric professor with a wild idea and some clover juice in a blender. But Patrick Brown had, as he put it himself, the very good fortune of living in the epicenter of venture capital. Because just a short bike ride from his home sat an office where a man named Vinod Khosla was waiting. And Khosla wasn't your typical investor. He was basically the high priest of Silicon Valley's most powerful belief, that the only ideas worth chasing are the ones that seem absolutely impossible. Most people think improbable ideas are unimportant, Khosla loved to say, but the only thing that's important is something that's improbable. When Brown walked into Khosla's office, his opening slide announced his audacious goal: make the entire meat industry obsolete. Khosla just stared at him with this delighted grin spreading across his face. "That's impossible," he said. And then he cut a check for $3 million to Brown's company, which would soon become known as Impossible Foods. This single story is your key to understanding one of the most powerful and wildly misunderstood forces shaping our world today: venture capital. It's the subject of Sebastian Mallaby's brilliant book, The Power Law, and we're about to unravel its secrets together. By the time we're done, you'll understand the hidden mindset that powers Silicon Valley. A mindset that has absolutely nothing to do with spreadsheets or fancy business school formulas, and everything to do with betting on unreasonable people with impossible dreams. You'll learn the secret rule that explains why, in the world of innovation, winners don't just take most of the pie, they take almost the entire bakery. This is the story of the financiers who don't just write checks, but who actively build the future, one audacious bet at a time. To truly get venture capital, you have to understand that it operates under completely different rules than basically any other kind of finance. Most of life follows what we call a normal distribution. Think about the height of American men, for example. Most guys cluster around the average of 5 feet 10 inches. You'll meet some who are 6'5" and some who are 5'5". But you're almost never going to bump into someone who's 9 feet tall or 3 feet tall. The outcomes all cluster around the middle. That's your classic bell curve. But venture capital doesn't live in the world of the bell curve. It lives in a world governed by something else entirely. Something called the Power Law. Imagine instead of a room full of average height people, you have a room representing American wealth. Most people have a typical amount of wealth. But then Jeff Bezos walks through the door. In that instant, the average wealth of everyone in the room skyrockets. One single outlier completely transforms the entire picture. In a power law world, outcomes don't cluster in the middle. Most ventures fail spectacularly, basically rounding to zero. A few do okay, but a tiny, tiny fraction, the outliers, the grand slams, generate returns so massive they pay for all the failures and then create mountains of profit on top. The biggest secret in venture capital, as investor Peter Thiel put it, is that the best investment in a successful fund equals or outperforms the entire rest of the fund combined. This isn't a home run business. It's a grand slam business. This single idea changes absolutely everything. It means that for a venture capitalist, playing it safe is actually the surest path to failure. Backing a company that might double or triple your money is basically pointless, because the true grand slams will return 1,000 times your investment. The only thing that matters is finding those outliers. The only thing that matters is betting on the impossible. And the story of how this strange high-stakes game came to be is really the story of Silicon Valley itself. It begins, as so many great stories do, with a rebellion. In 1957, the business world was a universe of gray flannel suits and rigid hierarchies. You joined a big corporation, worked loyally for decades, and retired with a gold watch. Innovation happened inside the giant research labs of companies like Bell Labs, not in garages or dorm rooms. In Palo Alto, California, a brilliant but tyrannical scientist named William Shockley had just won the Nobel Prize for co-inventing the semiconductor, the tiny switch that would become the foundation of our entire digital age. He assembled a team of the brightest young scientists in the country to start Shockley Semiconductor. Getting a call from him, one young researcher said, was like picking up the phone and talking to God. But God, it turned out, was a paranoid and abusive boss. Shockley was notorious for publicly humiliating people, posting salaries on bulletin boards to shame employees, and even demanding his staff take lie detector tests. He was systematically crushing the very genius he had recruited. Finally, 8 of his young researchers hit their breaking point. They were fed up. But what could they do? The idea of starting their own company simply didn't occur to them. In the 1950s, that's just not what people did. There was no system to fund a crew of unknown scientists with a dream. So they did the only thing that made sense. They wrote a letter to a Wall Street investment firm, hoping maybe some other big company would hire them as a team. That letter landed on the desk of a young, quiet financier named Arthur Rock. Rock was an outsider himself. He'd grown up poor, the child of immigrants, and he didn't fit the mold of the East Coast establishment. He read the letter and saw something no one else had. He saw pure talent, desperate to be set free. He flew out to San Francisco to meet these 8 rebels, and over dinner, he said something that would literally change the world. He didn't offer to find them new jobs. Instead, he said simply, "The way you do this is you start your own company." The researchers were stunned. As one of them, Gordon Moore, later admitted, "I'm not the sort who can just say, 'I'm going to start a company.' The accidental entrepreneur like me has to fall into the opportunity or be pushed into it." Arthur Rock was pushing them. He told them they wouldn't just be employees anymore. They would be founders. They would own the fruits of their own genius. This idea, what Mallaby calls liberation capital, was the spark. Rock had to approach 35 different potential investors before he found one willing to take the risk. But eventually he secured the financing for the 8 rebels, who would become known as the Traitorous 8. Their new company was called Fairchild Semiconductor. Fairchild would become the wellspring of Silicon Valley. It was a place run by engineers, not suits. They worked in a half-built building, literally rigging up their own power by hooking wires to a nearby electricity pole. Strategy was hashed out in freewheeling, chaotic bull sessions. New hires fresh out of grad school were empowered to make major decisions. The culture was messy, collaborative, and fiercely ambitious. And it worked. Within 2 years, Fairchild was wildly profitable. But more important than the company itself was the precedent it set. Arthur Rock had proven that talent didn't have to be trapped. With the right kind of funding, the best minds could break free and build their own future. And from Fairchild's roots, an entire forest would grow. Over the next few decades, employees left Fairchild to start their own companies, which were in turn funded by this new breed of venture capitalists. Those companies were nicknamed the Fairchildren. By 2014, an astonishing 70% of all publicly traded tech companies in Silicon Valley could trace their lineage directly back to that one act of rebellion funded by Arthur Rock. One of those companies, started by two of the original traitorous 8, was a little outfit you might have heard of, Intel. Arthur Rock had created the model, but the 1960s and 70s would refine it into something more powerful. Rock, along with his partner Tommy Davis, created the first modern venture capital firm, structured as a limited partnership. This was a crucial innovation. It meant they weren't using a corporation's money, which came with bureaucratic strings attached. They raised a dedicated fund from wealthy individuals and institutions, a war chest built specifically for betting on unproven ideas. And they articulated a completely new philosophy of risk. They didn't bother with the financial spreadsheets that other investors obsessed over. How can you possibly project cash flows for a company that has no customers and maybe not even a finished product? Instead, Rock said they invested in, quote, intellectual book value. They bet on people. The single most important factor, Rock declared, is of course management. He would flip straight to the back of a business plan just to read the founders' resumes. But the real revolution in the craft of venture capital came with the next generation, led by two firms that would become fierce arch-rivals, Sequoia Capital, founded by Don Valentine, and Kleiner Perkins, founded by Tom Perkins and Eugene Kleiner, one of the original traitorous 8. Don Valentine was the complete opposite of the quiet, reserved Arthur Rock. The son of a truck driver, Valentine was a tough, aggressive former semiconductor salesman. He believed venture capitalists shouldn't just be passive investors sitting on the sidelines. They needed to be active, hands-on builders. His approach was perfectly captured by his investment in a chaotic little video game company called Atari. Atari's founder, Nolan Bushnell, was a brilliant but wild creative force. He held business meetings in a hot tub and kept a beer tap right outside his office. The company was a disorganized mess. Most investors ran screaming for the hills. But Valentine saw the potential in their first hit game, Pong. He wasn't scared off by the chaos. He saw it as his job to impose some order on the madness. Valentine didn't just write a check and hope for the best. He practically wrote their entire business plan. He pushed them to create a home version of Pong, seeing a much bigger market than just bars and arcades. And he used his own network to land them a massive distribution deal with Sears, the retail giant of the era. He didn't invest first and hope things worked out. He got involved, helped de-risk the business, and only then put serious money to work. This was the birth of activist capital. And when Atari needed even more money to build its next-generation console, money that the small venture industry couldn't provide, Valentine orchestrated the sale of the entire company to Warner Communications, earning his fund a tidy profit. He had taken an essentially unbackable company and, through sheer force of will and expertise, turned it into a winner. His rival Tom Perkins was just as forceful, but with a different style. Perkins was an engineer from MIT and a Harvard Business School graduate. He and his partners at Kleiner Perkins believed in not just finding entrepreneurs, but actually creating them. They would incubate ideas right inside their own office. Their greatest triumph was a company called Genentech, which would pioneer the entire biotechnology industry. The idea came from a young, unemployed associate at their firm named Bob Swanson. Swanson became obsessed with a new technology called recombinant DNA, the ability to splice genes and essentially create artificial life. Everyone told him it was pure science fiction, decades away from being a real business. But Perkins and Swanson refused to back down. Perkins developed a strategy that would become a cornerstone of the venture capital playbook. He called it eliminating the quote, hot risks. Instead of building a giant, expensive lab from scratch, He told Swanson to use a tiny seed investment of just $100,000 to contract out the initial, riskiest experiments to existing university labs. It was essentially a virtual company, a nimble network of scientists assembled to solve one specific, crucial problem. This approach led to another key innovation: stage-by-stage financing. Perkins didn't give Genentech all the money it would ever need at once. He gave it just enough to reach the first major milestone. Once that milestone was hit, and some of the risk had evaporated, the company was more valuable, so it could raise the next round of money by giving away less equity. This process repeated, step by careful step. It kept the founders focused and disciplined, and it protected the investors' capital. It was a brilliant system for managing the profound uncertainty of building something from absolute nothing. Thanks to this activist, stage-by-stage approach, Genentech succeeded in creating synthetic insulin, a breakthrough that changed medicine forever. And when it went public in 1980, its stock price doubled in the first 20 minutes of trading, creating the first biotech blockbuster, and delivering a return of over 200 times Kleiner Perkins's investment. Together, Tandem, a fail-safe computer company, also incubated at Kleiner, and Genentech accounted for 95% of the profits of Kleiner's first fund. The power law was in full, glorious effect. The stories of Atari and Genentech show how venture capitalists are so much more than just financiers. They're strategists, recruiters, and coaches. But perhaps their most important role is as weavers of a network. The story of Apple's founding is the perfect example. When Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were building their first computer in a garage in 1976, they were turned down by almost every major investor in the Valley. Tom Perkins refused to even meet with them. Another prominent venture capitalist dismissed them as arrogant hippies. Nolan Bushnell, the Atari founder, was offered a third of Apple for $50,000. "I was so smart, I said no," he later lamented. It's kind of fun to think about that when I'm not crying. Jobs was stuck. But the magic of Silicon Valley isn't about any single person being a genius. It's about the density and strength of the network. Even when Bushnell rejected Jobs, he did him a crucial favor. He introduced him to his own venture capitalist, Don Valentine at Sequoia. Valentine was also skeptical of the long-haired Jobs, but he made a crucial suggestion. You need someone in the company who has some sense of management and marketing. And then Valentine did what great venture capitalists do best. He made another introduction. He connected Jobs to a retired Intel executive named Mike Markkula. Markkula wasn't a professional venture capitalist, but he was what we'd now call an angel investor, a wealthy tech veteran willing to back the next generation. Markkula saw the brilliance in Wozniak's design and wrote the first serious check into Apple. But even more valuable than his money, he brought his credibility and his own powerful network. Suddenly, Apple was no longer two hippies tinkering in a garage. It was a company connected to the very heart of the Valley's ecosystem. Markkula brought in Apple's first president from his network of Fairchild alumni. He got the Valley's top marketing guru who had previously rejected Jobs to design the iconic rainbow Apple logo. And he used his connections to get Apple back in front of the top venture capitalists, including the legendary Arthur Rock. This time, the VCs listened intently. The company had momentum. There was a buzz, a whisper spreading through the grapevine. As Mallaby puts it, circular logic could be sound logic. The fact that smart people were getting involved made other smart people want to get involved, creating a powerful self-fulfilling prophecy. In the end, Apple raised money from a syndicate of top firms. No single investor was the hero of the story. The network itself was the hero. This network-driven, power law-fueled machine was about to be supercharged by the greatest wealth creation event in human history, the commercialization of the Internet. The 1990s were the decade when the venture capital model, forged over the previous 30 years, collided with two explosive new forces: Moore's law, the observation that computing power doubles roughly every 2 years, and Metcalfe's law, the principle that the value of a network grows exponentially with the number of users. The combination was like pouring gasoline on an already roaring fire. John Doerr, who had risen to become the star partner at Kleiner Perkins, was one of the first to truly grasp the implications. He had worked as an engineer at Intel, so Moore's law wasn't just theory to him, he understood it viscerally. He had been close to the founders of networking companies, so he understood Metcalfe's law. He knew that these weren't just linear trends. They were compounding, exponential forces that would create entire industries out of thin air. This insight led him to make two of the most legendary investments in venture history. First, Netscape, the company that created the first popular web browser and opened the internet to the masses. Then Amazon, where he famously won the deal by convincing Jeff Bezos that Kleiner Perkins was the, quote, prime real estate of the internet world, even though another firm was offering a higher valuation. Doerr wasn't just investing in companies. He was evangelizing a vision of the future, a vision so compelling that the best entrepreneurs competed fiercely to be part of it. Meanwhile, at Sequoia, a quiet, British-born former journalist named Michael Moritz was making his own mark. His defining investment was in another pair of scruffy Stanford graduate students who had started a quirky hobby project, a directory of the nascent World Wide Web. Their project had a wonderfully silly name, Yahoo. When Moritz first met them in their messy trailer, he asked the obvious question, how much are you going to charge subscribers? The founders, Jerry Yang and David Filo, just looked at each other. This guy doesn't get it at all, they thought. Yahoo was free. The whole point was to build a massive audience first. The money would come later, from advertising. For most investors at the time, this was a completely bizarre concept. But Moritz, with his background in the media industry, understood it instantly. Radio and television networks gave away their content for free and made absolute fortunes from advertising. He saw the perfect analogy. He didn't just see a product. He saw an entirely new business model. And he saw something else crucial. He saw in Jerry Yang the potential to be the charismatic face of the Internet age, a new Steve Jobs for a new era. But the Yahoo deal would also introduce a new, formidable player who would fundamentally change the rules of the game, Masayoshi Son. Son was a Japanese-Korean entrepreneur, a true outsider who had built a software empire called SoftBank. When Yahoo needed its next round of funding, Son came to the table with a bazooka. In a move that was completely unprecedented, he offered to invest $100 million. At the time, that was more than the entire fund size of most established venture firms. When the Yahoo team hesitated, Son played his trump card. If I don't invest in Yahoo, he told them calmly, I'll invest in Excite, their main rival, and I'll kill you. It was an offer they simply couldn't refuse. Moritz was furious at being bullied, but he had learned a powerful lesson. In a winner-takes-all power law market, the investor with the biggest checkbook could become a kingmaker. Son wasn't just investing. He was essentially buying market dominance. This was the birth of growth equity, the practice of writing huge, late-stage checks to fuel a company's blitzkrieg march toward monopoly. The internet boom of the late 90s saw the venture capital model reach an absolute fever pitch. But it also sowed the seeds of the next rebellion. The dot-com bust of 2000 was a brutal, sobering hangover, wiping out fortunes and forcing a period of painful soul-searching. In its wake, a new generation of founders emerged, and they were fundamentally different. They had watched the rise and spectacular fall of the first internet giants, and they had drawn their own very specific conclusions. The leaders of this new wave were the founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. When they sought funding in 1999, they completely flipped the script. Instead of going hat-in-hand to the venture capitalists, they held an auction. They played the two top firms, Sequoia and Kleiner Perkins, against each other, and then, in an almost unheard-of move, forced them to co-invest on exactly equal terms, taking a much smaller stake than VCs were traditionally used to getting. They also fiercely resisted the classic VC move of bringing in a real CEO to replace the technical founders. They believed the people who built the technology should run the company. They only relented after John Doerr orchestrated a series of meetings for them with their heroes, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Andy Grove, who all advised them to get some experienced help. Even then, they brought in Eric Schmidt not as a boss who would push them aside, but as one part of a ruling triumvirate. And when Google went public, they introduced a dual-class share structure that gave them and other insiders 10 votes for every single vote that public shareholders received, ensuring they would never lose control of their creation. The balance of power had decisively, permanently shifted. This shift was articulated most forcefully by a programmer and essayist named Paul Graham. In a series of influential blog posts, Graham argued that the old venture capital model was fundamentally broken. Software startups didn't need huge amounts of capital anymore. The internet and open-source tools made it possible to build a real product with very little money. He famously and bluntly declared, "Spend as little as you can, because every dollar of the investor's money you get will be taken out of your backside." Graham argued that big venture capital funds were like farmers force-feeding geese to make foie gras. They pushed startups to take too much money, grow too fast, and lose the quirky genius and nimble creativity that made them special in the first place. In 2005, Graham put his controversial ideas into practice. He started Y Combinator, a completely new kind of startup incubator. Instead of big one-off investments, Y Combinator would give tiny amounts of seed money, just enough for rent and ramen noodles, to an entire batch of startups at once. It would mentor them as a group for 3 intense months, and then present them all to a room full of later-stage investors on a single demo day. It was a brilliant hack on the venture capital system, designed perfectly for a world where young people were, as the next great founder would soon declare, just smarter. That founder was, of course, Mark Zuckerberg. When he showed up at Sequoia's office in 2004, late for an 8 a.m. meeting and wearing pajama bottoms, it was the ultimate symbol of the youth revolt. His presentation was titled, "The Top 10 Reasons You Should Not Invest." He was openly, brazenly mocking the most powerful firm in the entire valley. And he was doing it because he genuinely didn't need them. He was being advised by Sean Parker, the infamous co-founder of Napster, who had his own personal grudge against Sequoia after being fired from a previous startup. And he had already secured his first $500,000 investment not from a traditional venture capitalist, but from an angel investor who was part of this new rebel alliance, Peter Thiel. Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, would go on to launch his own venture firm, Founders Fund, with a simple, radical promise: they would never fire a founder. Thiel believed deeply that the truly transformative companies, the ones that followed the power law, were created by singular, often quite strange, visionaries. The job of a venture capitalist wasn't to tame them with so-called adult supervision. It was to find the brilliant oddballs and empower them to do their best work. The rise of Thiel's Founders Fund, Graham's Y Combinator, and the flood of angel money from newly successful entrepreneurs created a new, hyper-competitive landscape. For the established firms like Sequoia, it was a risk the franchise continuously moment, as their leader Doug Leone put it. And Sequoia's response was an absolute masterclass in adaptation. While Kleiner Perkins stumbled badly, chasing the noble but incredibly difficult dream of cleantech, and struggling with painful internal turmoil, Sequoia completely reinvented itself. They didn't just fight the new trends. They absorbed and co-opted them. They created their own Scouts program, giving money to active entrepreneurs to make angel investments on Sequoia's behalf, effectively co-opting the entire angel network. They built an internal machine dedicated to helping founders with operations, mimicking the bold promise of Andreessen Horowitz, a new powerhouse firm started by the founder of Netscape. They refined their decision-making processes, using insights from behavioral psychology to actively combat their own cognitive biases. And, having learned the harsh lesson of Masayoshi Son, they raised massive growth funds to compete at the late stage. along with a hedge fund to bet on public markets. Most audaciously, they went truly global. While other firms saw the entire world from their comfortable perch on Sand Hill Road, Sequoia built autonomous, full-fledged partnerships in China and India, led by brilliant local talent like Neil Shen and Shailendra Singh. They understood that the power law wasn't confined to California. They sprinkled capital on the incredibly fertile ground of Asia's booming economies and stirred. The result was stunning. By the late 2010s, Sequoia's most profitable investment ever wasn't Google or Apple. It was a Chinese food delivery company called Meituan. This brings us to the modern era, the age of the unicorn, private companies valued at over $1 billion. The rise of growth investors like Yuri Milner and Tiger Global meant that successful startups could stay private for far longer, raising hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, without facing the harsh scrutiny of the public markets. This created a new and genuinely dangerous dynamic, perfectly captured by the cautionary tales of WeWork and Uber. In both cases, visionary and deeply aggressive founders, Adam Neumann at WeWork and Travis Kalanick at Uber, were showered with billions of dollars from late-stage investors who cared far more about getting into a hot deal than about basic governance or oversight. These weren't the traditional, hands-on venture capitalists of the past. They were mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds, and crossover investors like Masayoshi Son's new $100 billion vision fund. They often didn't even take board seats or demand the basic controls that a firm like Sequoia or Benchmark would absolutely insist upon. The result was a complete governance vacuum. The founders were given essentially absolute power, often through supervoting shares, and they used it to pursue reckless growth at literally any cost. Bill Gurley of Benchmark, Uber's brilliant early investor, found himself utterly trapped. He was sitting on one of the greatest paper profits in the entire history of venture capital, but he was completely powerless to stop Kalanick's increasingly destructive behavior, which ranged from burning billions in a feudal price war in China to fostering a deeply toxic company culture. The sagas of Uber and WeWork brutally exposed the dark side of founder empowerment and the dangers of a flood of undisciplined capital. Gurley, in a heroic and almost unprecedented move for a venture capitalist, ended up leading a coup to oust Kalanick, the very founder he had originally backed, in order to save the company from destroying itself. WeWork's implosion happened only when it was finally forced into the harsh, unforgiving light of the public markets during its spectacularly failed IPO attempt. These stories were a stark, sobering reminder that while venture capital is fundamentally about liberating talent, it's also about providing responsible stewardship. The pendulum had swung wildly from the overbearing adult supervision of the early days to a near-total abdication of oversight and governance. And as we stand today, the venture world is still actively trying to find the right, sustainable balance. So what do we take away from this incredible journey through 60 years of ambition, rebellion, and genuinely world-changing innovation? For me, the most powerful lesson in Sebastian Mallaby's The Power Law is that venture capital isn't really a category of finance at all. It's a philosophy, a way of seeing. It's a way of looking at the world that is fundamentally, almost naively optimistic and deeply, necessarily contrarian. It's the unshakable belief that the future isn't something to be predicted from spreadsheets. It's something to be discovered and built through a series of bold, iterative experiments. The venture capitalists in these stories, from Arthur Rock to Michael Moritz, weren't just allocating capital efficiently, they were allocating belief. They looked at a team of rebels and saw Fairchild. They looked at a chaotic video game maker and saw Atari. They looked at a couple of students working in a trailer and saw Yahoo. They were betting on the improbable, because they understood in their bones that in a world governed by the power law, the only things that truly matter, the only things that move the needle, are the things that at first seem completely impossible. And this mindset, I genuinely believe, is something we can all learn from and apply, especially when you're young and just starting out on your own path. It's so incredibly easy to fall into the comfortable trap of incremental improvement, of trying to be just a little bit better than everyone else in your field. But this book teaches us to think completely differently. It encourages us to hunt for our own power law opportunities, our own 10 times or 100 times bets. What does that actually look like in practice? Here are a few thoughts to consider. First, apply the power law to your own skills and projects. Instead of trying to be reasonably good at 10 different things, ask yourself a tough question. What is the one skill, the one specific area of knowledge, where I can become truly exceptional, where I can be in the top 1%? What is the one project that, if it actually succeeds, could change everything for me? Most of what we do in life yields pretty average results. The secret is to ruthlessly identify the few things that can deliver an extraordinary, disproportionate return on your precious time and energy. Don't waste your time building a slightly better mousetrap. Try to invent something as revolutionary as the cat. Second, deeply understand the genuine power of networks. The biggest myth of Silicon Valley is the romantic myth of the lone genius toiling away in isolation. As this book demonstrates again and again, real success is fundamentally a team sport. It's all about the rich connections between people, ideas, and capital. For you, right now, today, this means that the people you choose to surround yourself with are absolutely everything. Don't just network mechanically to get a job or make surface-level connections. Deliberately build a genuine tribe of smart, ambitious, and truly supportive peers who challenge you, believe in you, and push you to be better. The introductions you generously make and the help you selflessly offer today could very well become the foundation of your own Fairchild moment, years or even decades from now. And finally, don't be afraid to back unreasonable people, and that starts with yourself. The heroes and heroines of this book are all, in their own unique way, a little bit crazy. They're what Vinod Khosla beautifully calls creatively maladjusted. They have the glorious, unreasonable hubris to believe they can genuinely change the world. Society constantly encourages us to be reasonable, to fit in comfortably, to follow the safe, established path. But real progress, the kind that matters, depends entirely on the people who are unreasonable enough to imagine a radically different path, and brave enough to actually try to build it. If you have an idea that smart people keep telling you is impossible, you just might be onto something truly extraordinary. That was a summary of The Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. We've journeyed through the highlights today, from the dramatic birth of Silicon Valley to the complex age of the unicorn. But I'll be completely honest with you, a summary like this can only ever be a map, a rough sketch. The real treasure, the real insights and inspiration are found when you explore the full territory for yourself. The true magic of this book is in the rich, granular detail of the stories, the fascinating personalities, and the nail-biting high-stakes decisions that shaped our modern world. This summary is designed to give you an exciting glimpse and help you decide if this deeper journey is right for you. If any of the stories or ideas we've discussed today sparked something inside you, if you felt even a flicker of excitement, then I genuinely can't recommend grabbing a copy of the full book highly enough. Reading it isn't just about learning business history or Silicon Valley trivia. It's about understanding and potentially adopting a powerful mindset that could genuinely change your own future. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it gave you a fresh perspective or a new way of thinking, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could take just a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells me that these deep dives are genuinely helpful to you, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another potentially life-changing book. Let's keep learning, growing, and building together.